Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. Today we're looking into something really interesting, the relationship between China and its neighbors like Japan and the U.S.
Yeah.
It's kind of paradoxical, wouldn't you say?
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you've got so many Chinese folks expressing, negative sentiments towards these countries, but at the same time, they're investing heavily in them, both financially and, sending their kids to study there.
Right, exactly. It's a really interesting contrast there. So that's what we're going to unpack today.
Yeah.
You've got research from, articles to personal accounts, and we're going to try and figure out, what's driving this whole complex situation.
Yeah, it's a head-scratcher for sure.
Yeah. So let's start with something that's been kind of coming up a lot in our listener inbox, which is this idea of hate education.
Right.
Can you break that down for us a little bit? What is that, and why is it so significant in China?
Yeah, so essentially hate education, it's a way for the Chinese government to use education and propaganda to highlight historical wrongdoings, particularly by Japan and the U.S.
Okay.
And this is really all about shaping national identity, justifying political actions, all while creating this kind of shared sense of grievance against these countries.
So it's like using history to sort of create this us versus them mentality.
Exactly. Yeah. You see, they heavily emphasize things like the Nanjing Massacre and the Japanese occupation.
Right.
And really driving home the brutality of those events. And when it comes to the U.S., they frame the Korean War as a victory against American aggression.
Okay.
Furthering this image of the U.S. as a hostile force.
So it's not just about teaching history. It's about using history to shape how people see the world and their place in it.
Exactly. And it becomes a very powerful tool for the government to, control the narrative, build a sense of national unity, and reinforce their role as protector of the Chinese people.
Right. And it's not just in textbooks. This seems to seep into other aspects of Chinese society, too.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you see it in state-controlled media, in public memorials. You even see it in popular culture.
Right.
It's a constant reinforcement of this historical narrative.
So we've got this system that's designed to, foster negative sentiment towards Japan and the U.S.
Yeah.
I think we've got this really baffling paradox, which is that many Chinese citizens are pouring money into these countries.
Right.
Investing in real estate, sending their kids to study there, even choosing to emigrate there. So what's going on with that?
I think it really comes down to a clash between emotion and practicality.
Okay.
So while hate education is targeting these collective feelings, individual choices are often driven by, a desire for personal gain and security. I mean, think about it. People want a good education for their kids.
Yeah.
They want a stable political environment, and they want the opportunity to build a better future.
Yeah.
And sometimes they feel like they can find that more readily in places like the U.S. and Japan.
And the research really backs that up, right? We saw some pretty staggering statistics about this.
Yeah.
In 2023, Chinese individuals made up a full 36% of EB-5 visa applicants.
Wow.
Which is that investment-based program for U.S. immigration.
Right.
So clearly, even if the rhetoric is anti-U.S., the actions are telling a very different story.
Absolutely. And it goes beyond immigration, too. I mean, the U.S. remains a top destination for Chinese students, even in 2024.
Yeah, it's almost like hate the government, love the real estate kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw that despite all the criticisms of U.S. policies in 2023 on social media, Chinese buyers were still a major driving force in the U.S. real estate market.
Exactly. And let's not forget, Japan, a significant percentage of wealthy Chinese individuals are looking at overseas real estate.
Sure.
And Japan is right up there on the list with the U.S.
Interesting.
Something like 60% are considering those kinds of investments in 2024.
Wow. So it seems like, this hate education hasn't totally wiped out those practical needs and desires.
Yeah.
People are still making decisions based on what they see as the best options for their own lives, even if it clashes with the official narrative.
Absolutely. Actions speak louder than words, as they say.
Right. And speaking of actions, what about tourism? If there's all this negativity towards Japan, you'd think that would discourage people from actually going there, right?
You would think so, but the numbers tell a different story. I mean, those 90 and third-generation Chinese travelers, they're actually dominating Japan's tourism market right now.
Really?
Yeah, they make up over 60% of arrivals, and they're accounting for 55% of total spending.
That's wild. So even with all this historical tension, Japan is still a huge draw for them.
It is, and it really speaks to the complexity of this whole thing, right? There's this disconnect between what's being pushed and the choices individuals are making.
It's like, okay, we might have a complicated history, but I still want to see your country.
Exactly. It highlights the power of, individual curiosity, that desire to connect with the world, even when there's all this baggage.
So we've got these conflicting motivations then, right?
Okay.
Negativity from the hate education, but also this drive for personal gain and exploration.
Yeah.
But what about the younger generations who've grown up immersed in this system?
Right.
Like, how are they navigating this whole thing?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. I mean, these younger generations, they're digital natives. They've come of age in, a rapidly changing China. They've seen this economic boom. They're plugged into this globalized world. And yet they've also been exposed to this intense hate education from a really young age. Yeah. And it creates this really interesting kind of push and pull.
So it's like they're straddling two worlds, right? One that's telling them to be distrustful and resentful, and another that's offering all these opportunities and different perspectives.
Exactly. And you see this reflected in their behavior. On the one hand, you see them, exhibiting these strong nationalistic sentiments, especially online.
Yeah.
I mean, social media is like a huge echo chamber for these kinds of narratives.
Right.
And young people are very much caught up in that.
Well, yeah. I mean, they're the ones who grew up with that as their primary source of information and connection, really.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Even while they're expressing these nationalistic views, they're also engaging in these behaviors that seem completely contradictory.
Okay, give us some examples. Like, what does that look like?
Well, you'll see young people criticizing the U.S. online, maybe even participating in boycotts of American brands. But then they turn around and consume American entertainment and products like crazy Hollywood movies, American music, the latest iPhones. They're not immune to it.
It's a real love-hate thing, huh?
It's fascinating. And you see a similar kind of pattern emerge with Japan as well. They may condemn, past actions, but then they'll flock to Japan for travel and soak up the culture.
So there's this disconnect between what they're being told and how they're actually choosing to interact with the world.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting question, like why this apparent hypocrisy?
Right.
And I think a key factor here is access to information.
All right.
Unlike older generations, these young people have grown up with the internet.
Right.
They're exposed to this vast array of viewpoints and perspectives that challenge, the monolithic narrative they get through hate education.
So it's a more nuanced view of the world.
Absolutely. I mean, platforms like YouTube and TikTok, they give them this window into other cultures and ways of thinking. They're seeing that the enemy isn't always so black and white.
It's like they're getting hate education in the classroom, and then they're getting like love education online.
Yeah.
It's no wonder they're struggling with these ideas.
Yeah, it's a very unique dynamic for sure. And I think it's pushing them towards a more pragmatic outlook.
Okay.
They're less concerned with ideological conformity and more focused on their own personal goals and aspirations.
So, like, their own ambitions are kind of taking precedence over this nationalistic narrative.
I think so, yeah. They're making choices based on what they believe will lead to a better future for themselves, whether that's studying abroad, pursuing certain career opportunities, or even just, experiencing the world.
Makes sense. And, they're not necessarily rejecting the narratives they've been taught.
Yeah.
But they're also not letting it dictate every single move they make.
Yeah.
They're finding their own path.
Exactly. And this kind of brings us to another really fascinating aspect of this whole dynamic, which is, the issue of cultural clashes, particularly in the context of tourism.
Oh, yeah. We've had a ton of listeners write in about this.
Really?
Yeah. Particularly the behavior of some Chinese tourists abroad, especially in Japan. This has become kind of a hot topic.
Yeah.
What's your take on that whole situation?
It's a sensitive issue for sure. I mean, there have been a number of high-profile incidents involving Chinese tourists that have really sparked a lot of controversy and resentment among locals in Japan.
Like, what kind of incidents are we talking about?
Well, there have been, reports of tourists being excessively loud on public transportation.
Okay.
There have been cases of littering or even damaging public property. Some have been observed disregarding cues or ignoring basic social etiquette.
Yeah, those are pretty significant faux pas.
They are. And, it's important to remember that these behaviors obviously aren't representative of all Chinese tourists.
Of course.
But they do contribute to these negative stereotypes. And they highlight those cultural differences between the two nations.
So it's not just about, like, individual bad behavior. It's also about, these different cultural norms and expectations.
Exactly. And it's creating friction on both sides. Locals might feel disrespected, while some visitors, might feel unfairly judged or targeted.
Right. It sounds like there's a lot of room for misunderstanding and resentment there.
There is. Yeah. And it doesn't help that those historical sensitivities are already running high.
Right.
The legacy of Japan's wartime actions still casts a shadow over the relationship.
Of course.
So any perceived disrespect can really easily escalate tensions.
And then there's the economic angle too, right? Like Japan relies heavily on tourism revenue.
Right.
So it's a tough spot to be in.
It is. They want the economic benefits, but they also have to manage the cultural and social impacts.
It's a delicate balancing act.
It is, finding ways to promote responsible tourism, foster greater cultural understanding, while also, addressing the concerns of their own citizens.
Okay, so we've got this web of hate education, these conflicting motivations, the cultural clashes. It's a lot to think about. But what does all this mean for the future of, China's relationships with Japan and the U.S.?
Right.
Like, what should we be looking out for as this story continues to unfold?
Well, it's a dynamic situation, constantly evolving.
Yeah.
But there are a few key trends that are worth paying attention to. Well, one of the big things is that, the rise of Chinese nationalism, it's not going away anytime soon. Yeah. If anything, it's probably going to intensify.
Okay.
It's fueled by this hate education, and it's amplified by, the echo chambers of social media.
Yeah.
And that's going to continue to create all sorts of challenges for, diplomacy and intercultural understanding.
So not exactly smooth sailing ahead then.
No, I think we're in for some choppy waters, but there is a glimmer of hope here. And it's those younger generations that we were talking about, the ones who are kind of straddling these two worlds.
Right.
They could actually hold the key to a more nuanced and, balanced future.
See, they think they could be the bridge builders.
Yeah.
Ones who help kind of smooth things over.
Yeah, exactly. I think they're the ones who are more likely to see collaboration and cooperation as the way forward, even with countries that have this complicated history. Yeah. They understand that the world is interconnected and that building bridges is ultimately in everyone's best interest.
Well, that's encouraging. Gives me a little more faith in humanity.
Yeah.
Anything else that we should be keeping an eye on?
Well, China's global influence is only going to continue to grow.
Right.
And that means more interactions with the rest of the world, which could lead to, greater understanding and cultural exchange. But it also has the potential for more friction and conflict. It's a double-edged sword.
That's like walking a tightrope. Right? More engagement is good, but you also have to be really careful to avoid missteps.
Exactly. And, as all of this plays out, it raises some pretty profound questions.
Okay.
About the future of globalization and nationalism. Are they compatible forces, or are we headed towards this clash of civilizations?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It is.
It feels like we're at a crossroads.
Yeah.
The world's more interconnected than ever, but at the same time, those nationalistic sentiments are on the rise.
It's a fascinating and critical juncture in history.
It really is.
And as China continues to, assert itself on the global stage, these questions are only going to become more and more urgent.
We have covered a lot of ground today, from hate education to cultural clashes, conflicting motivations, the hopes for future generations. I mean, this deep dive has been quite the journey.
It has.
And I think, one of the biggest takeaways is that this is a complex issue.
Right.
There are no easy answers here.
Absolutely.
It's a reminder that we need to, go beyond those headlines and sound bites to really understand the nuances of what's going on.
I think that's key. It's about recognizing, the historical baggage, acknowledging the cultural differences, and, appreciating the individual stories within this larger narrative.
Right. Well said. Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I do want to give a shout out to our favorite travel vlogger, Mickytolife.
Oh, yeah, he's great.
If you're looking for more cultural insights, travel stories, even some whiskey reviews, head over to his YouTube channel. You will not be disappointed.
No, you won't.
It's like a mini deep dive into all these different cultures, one sip at a time.
I love it.
Thanks for joining us on this exploration, everyone. Until next time, keep sipping, keep talking, and keep exploring the world around you.